Billiamklavon here. Welcome to another episode of Thursdeighties, the Greatest Decade podcast, where it's always morning in America. That was my Ronald Reagan impression, or more precisely, my impression of the Ronald Reagan impression from Back to the Future Part 2. You know, growing up as a small-town kid who's a bit overweight, kinda uncoordinated, uninterested in sports, not terribly fashion-conscious, think lots of stripes and plaids often worn together, and Belmar gym shoes from Farm and Fleet. And your go-to when rebutting is a funny word, some rich kid's critique of, well, any of the things I just listed, is to quote Mork from Ork, Spock, Fonzie, George Carlin, maybe Yoda. Well, you're kind of set up for some serious character building. And by that measure, my character ought to be about 180 stories tall. On the other hand, if you had a rich inner life and an imagination, or better yet, regular after-school access to a comic book spinner, rack, or newsstand, I'm here to tell you from experience that that was enough to make the day-to-day struggles navigating life in elementary school, and eventually junior high, disappear in the rearview mirror. For me, it was a little shop in downtown Geneseo, Illinois, called The Bookstore. It was stocked with everything you might need for your budding art, craft, or calligraphy hobby, maybe a birthday card in a pinch, plus the rich aroma of fancy stationery. And despite the promise contained in the store's name, the actual book section of the bookstore was no bigger than an 8x6 corner next to the street-facing display window. That didn't matter to me, not one bit. Because in that 8x6 corner was everything I needed to help me remember that there was more to the world than dipshits whose undoubtedly challenging home lives or personal demons made them cruel. Kids can be mean, but the bookstore was my refuge. Now, we lived about 8 miles outside of town, so when I had an after-school activity that meant no bus ride home, I'd walk down to the Farmers National Bank, where my mom worked as a teller, so that she could drive me home after her shift. Of course, that meant I could swing by my therapist's office, the bookstore, with its fine selection of the best that Marvel and DC had to offer. My go-tos were Marvel's The Incredible Hulk and Captain America, DC's Action Comics, with the occasional Topps trading card pack as an after-comic aperitif, if I was flush with dimes, purloined from my dad's spare change bucket. Not baseball cards, no, movie or TV cards, depending on what was popular in theaters or on television at the time. The comics were my lifeline, though. A guy who, whenever he gets angry, changes into a green-skinned wrecking machine. An honest, decent, regular person who maintains his integrity despite being gifted with super soldier serum superpowers. Say that 3 times fast. And even beats up the occasional Nazi. Yeah, sign me up. More than 40 years later, it's hard to remember a time that the future of comic books and superheroes was far from secured. We live in a world of comic book media giants, with hundreds of comic book-inspired live-action films, streaming TV series, and animation. But in the early 80s, the comic book publishers were at a crossroads. Circulation was down, the industry was in a rut, and comic book storytelling had to evolve and change to survive. The sun was beginning to set for the towering heroes, the artists and writers who built and defined so many of the characters we love today. They were about to pass the torch to the next generation of creators, talented folks who themselves had grown up steeped in the lore of Batman, Superman, Daredevil, the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Avengers, and so many more. But comic book kids like me had no idea what was happening behind the scenes at DC or Marvel. We were back here on Earth, in my case, small-town Midwest America, champing at the bit for the next issue of our favorite book to arrive on the newsstand. We remained blissfully unaware as our comic book future unfolded on the distant island of Manhattan or the gritty subleased offices of Hollywood, unaware that there were heroes among our own who would bravely step up and save the comic book day. This is not their story. But it is the story of one young hero whose name, unknown to most, came to define at least one big moment of action in Captain America: Winter Soldier. 20 seconds of screen time that will forever remind us that gravity doesn't behave in quite the same way for the first Avenger. My guest today was only 17 years old when he bluffed his way into a job at Marvel Comics back in 1984, and by his own admission, has continued to bluff his way to a successful career as a product designer, a builder, a thought leader in digital innovation at companies like NBC Universal and Comcast, the BBC Studio, and now Meta. I met him when we both worked together at AOL in the early 2000s. Yes, you heard that right, AOL. I'm now pausing for the usual laughter and maybe some Googling. While that company worked to reinvent itself after its disastrous acquisition of Time Warner. Non-spoiler alert, it was unsuccessful. He and his beautiful family now live in Spain, where he undoubtedly enjoys great food, incredible culture, fabulous scenery, all while reinventing the world one pixel at a time. Friends, if you have an iPhone, an iPad, a MacBook, or an Apple Watch, cover their ears. Then join me in welcoming Marc Siry to Thursdeighties. Hey, Marc.
Hey, Bill. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that great intro. Really appreciate it.
It's funny because we have known each other for 20 years, and yet we kind of dip back in every once in a while serendipitously, and every time we do, I find out more intriguing things about Marc Siry that I didn't know before. And the conversation today is about one of those things, which was not just a delight to discover, but also opportunistically made for what I thought would be a great conversation.
Well, thanks. Look, when you fumble your way through life, you skin your knee quite a bit, and so people dig stars.
That's right. Well, then today is going to be fantastic.
We're going to be
Um,
uncovering a lot of old wounds.
that's what I like to hear. If by the end of this conversation, one or both of us aren't weeping, I will feel like we have failed. Uh,
I'll do my best.
Now, of course, I have to start every episode with Thursdeighties with just a quick quiz, because it's always very important to me to know and ground myself in where my friend and guest falls within their knowledge of the 80s. So, three quick questions. These are kind of Coke or Pepsi questions. Don't think too much about them, but I'll hit you with them right now. You ready?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. Number one, what was your favorite 80s movie?
Oh, that one's easy. So, like you, I was a huge Trekkie growing, watching the original Star Trek in syndication. And when the first Star Trek movie came out in the 70s, I was, suffice to say, a little disappointed. And so when Wrath of Khan came out in, was it 1983? Was
82.
Wrath of Khan?
Summer of
82,
82.
82. Yeah, yeah. Uh, and I went to see Wrath of Khan. It was like, to me, that was the first time that Star Trek had come to life.
Great answer. I think my dream would be that we secure one of the members of the cast or crew. Nicholas Meyer would actually be my favorite to come on, and we'll do a conversation about Wrath of Khan. So great
Yeah,
answer.
I'll subscribe and listen to that. I'm already subscribed, but I'm looking forward to that one.
Awesome. The next question: what was your favorite 80s television show?
I'm not 100% sure it was fully in the 80s, but the A-Team. I
Oh,
don't know, was the A-Team
it was fully in the 80s for
fully in the
sure.
80s? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, what I loved about the A-Team, being a comics guy, it felt like the Avengers in real life. There was always some sort of setback where they ended up tied up in the back of a pickup truck and thrown out into the desert. But then
Right.
at the end, they always came together and, in the hail of somehow non-lethal gunfire, managed to, save the day.
Also a great answer. Last 80s question. What was your favorite 80s music? And that could be a performer, an album, song. What was your go-to?
My first album I ever bought was Devo. I was a huge Devo fanatic. I followed them into the 80s and, they were my favorite band all through high school. But then right smack in the middle of the 80s or close to it, suddenly I went to see Purple Rain, and
Oh
suddenly
boy.
Prince was everything to
Oh
me.
boy.
I bought his old stuff. I saw him in concert like 3 times. I skipped school to see him. I waited overnight at Ticketmaster on
Oh,
48th Street to get the tickets. I was nuts for Prince. When I went to college and I was in college, suddenly my eyes opened to the Pixies. And so
Oh,
the
man.
Pixies, someone said that not many people have heard the Pixies, but everyone who has wanted to start a band. And to this day, they're still all three of those bands are actually still super high in my rotation.
That's an '80s journey, man. Devo to Prince to the Pixies and
Yeah.
beyond.
Yeah.
Um, well, all great answers, all completely correct. And as I've said before, you advance to the next round.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, we do not have a home version of this game, so you're out of
Someday.
yeah. Someday. Yes, Thursdeighties the home game. Okay, well that's great. I one of my favorite things. I love a good origin story, and in your case, as I learned a bit about your teen years and beyond, was so intrigued. Give me a bit more about your origin story. Tell me about where you grew up, how you grew up, and of course, the capstone to that is, as I mentioned in the outset, how you bluffed your way at 17 into Marvel for a job.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, unlike you, I did not grow up in a small town with John Cougar Camp. I grew up where they make the best fake salsa, New York City. So when you first talked about your touchstones in your first episode, I was like, yes, 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 yes. So it's strange that the two of us separated by half a continent and, but only less than a year, I think, or so in age. We just had literally were swimming in the same cultural
Right.
waters. So, but yeah, I grew up a lower middle class kid in Queens, New York. But I pulled the winning lottery ticket of being able to test for and then ultimately be admitted to a selective admission public school, public, so it was free, called Hunter College High School in
Hmm,
Manhattan. And
okay.
so that's how a kid from literally, I lived behind the junkyard next to Shea Stadium. Uh, I somehow suddenly was attending school on the Upper East Side with kids from Park Avenue, literally, and kids from Riverdale in the Bronx, and kids from Chelsea.
Holy
And
cow.
so I was pulled out of my sort of near suburban existence in the outer borough and dropped into this world and exposed to things I'd never seen. And I remember sitting in my first English class and looking around and going, "Oh my God, these are rich kids. These are kids. What am I doing here?" The total imposter syndrome. So now this school is, New York is known for some of its sort of like famous high schools. One of them that people always talk about is Stuyvesant. Another one is Bronx High School of Science. This was sort of the third of that triad, that nuclear triad of selective admission schools. It was a
Yeah,
liberal arts, and some of the more famous alum than myself that you may have heard of, I'll start from the order of most famous, is Lin-Manuel Miranda,
heard of
who
him.
was there about 10 years after me. Um, Cynthia Nixon, who was there about 2 or 3 years before me. Chris Hayes from MSNBC,
Sure.
about 10 years behind me. Martin Shkreli, the famous
Oh,
like
farmer bro.
drug bro, right? Whatever. Yeah, also a Hunter graduate.
Oh,
And for
man.
me, the one nearest and dearest to my heart, both literally and figuratively, in my year was Marvin Young, otherwise known as Young MC.
Ah,
So
amazing. So
anyhow,
you're saying though that Lin-Manuel Miranda rode your coattails. That's what I'm really hearing.
yeah, totally, totally. Well, he and I had the same social studies teacher, Irving Steinfink, and if you Google Lin-Manuel Miranda's origin story, he credits Irving Steinfink for, giving him the idea to do a report on Hamilton, so
Holy
it
cow.
all comes back to that. The reason I'm dwelling on Hunter so much is because Hunter was my springboard to being able to bluff my way into Marvel. Hunter had a special program where they compressed the 6 years of what was called the New York State Regents education, which
Mhm.
typically went from grade 7 through 12, into 5 years. So by the time you were graduating or ending your 11th grade, you could do 3 things. You could graduate early and then go on to college somewhere, and that wasn't gonna happen for me. I barely made it through this school, my grades were awful. You could take college level courses, you would spend the morning in the 12th grade taking college level courses, AP courses at the high school. And then in the afternoon, you could take college level courses at Hunter College, which was the college that was associated with Hunter College High
Ah,
School. The third thing, and this was what really caught my eye, is you could take a work credit internship. I wasn't going to take AP level courses. I could barely make it through my, high school level courses. So I didn't want
friends,
to feel
I'm going to interrupt
stupid.
Mark because this is shocking to me because Mark is one of the smartest human beings that I've ever worked with and met. So as much as I hear what you're saying, I'm dubious about your was it more about applying yourself than it was about understanding?
Yeah, maybe I, was capable, but I was not, maybe I wasn't doing school correctly.
Ah,
And there's a lot of reasons for that. Suffice to say, I was one of those kids that everyone said, "You're so smart. Why are you failing all your classes?" Right? So,
got it.
um,
That makes more sense.
anyhow, yeah. So wasn't going to do the AP classes. Wasn't going to graduate early. So they basically called me in and said, "You need to choose now, otherwise you're going to fail out of school."
Oh my God.
And so I was scanning down the list, and it was all things like, Chase Manhattan Bank finance intern, or working at the New York Times as a copy desk intern. And suddenly, as I slid down the list, Marvel Comics intern.
Oh my God.
And I said, and look, I hadn't been a huge comics guy, but I had always loved drawing. And I had, years earlier when I was visiting my relatives in Puerto Rico, I had stumbled on like a stash of old like comic books for a dime in a Puerto Rican drugstore, and basically lived on them all summer because they were the only English reading material I had.
Wow.
So I looked at the guidance counselor. I said, "I'm going to do the Marvel Comics thing." And the guidance counselor said, "Actually, no, you're not," because that was the most popular one that filled up on day one. If you had followed instructions and shown up and like had any ounce of responsibility in your body, maybe you could have Marvel Comics, but
Ouch.
pick something else. And so I don't recall what I picked, but it was something close to Marvel on the list. So as I pretended to write down the number for the other internship, I actually wrote down the number of Marvel Comics.
Brilliant.
And then I immediately ran down 2 blocks to the corner of 96th Street and Lexington Avenue, jumped in a payphone, sort of like a reverse Superman. It was weird because I'm going to Marvel and not DC. Jumped in the payphone, threw in a dime. I called the number, and the person who picked up the phone on the other end ended up being my boss at Marvel for several years. Lynn Cohen was her name, wonderful woman. I said, "Hey, I'm calling. I'm part of the Hunter internship program, and I'm your newest intern."
Oh
And
my
she
God.
and she said, "Oh, I thought we had filled our quota of interns." And I'm like, "Oh no, that's strange because I was just in the guidance office, and they told me that they needed to fill this spot because they had promised you 5 interns." And so she was like, "Oh, well, I guess I thought it was only supposed to be 4, but okay, well." Can you be here in 10 minutes? Because today is supposed to be the first day.
Wow.
And so I ran down to the subway. I tailed it down to 28th and Park, and that was my first day of my fake job at Marvel Comics.
That
You know,
is extraordinary. And by the way, for the kids at home, a payphone is a thing that used to exist where you walked into a small, clear room in the middle of a street, inserted whatever change you had in your pocket, and made a phone call. We'll cover
you
that in
fir-
another episode.
so anyhow, the point is that this poor woman, Lynn, had no idea that I was there completely on my own volition. My high school had no idea I was there. They
Oh,
thought I was doing something else. She would give me my progress reports to take back to my guidance counselor, and I'd crumple them up and throw them into a trash can on Park Avenue. Um, but the point of the matter is, for a year, I got coffee, I made Xeroxes, I opened fan mail, and most importantly, I got to swim in the culture of the people who had created Marvel Comics in the 1960s and who were still every day, day in, day out, crafting these stories, publishing these comics, creating these legends that, as you said at the outset, are now even with us today and are bigger than ever. Some
yeah.
of these comic book characters have evolved into media juggernauts.
Right.
And I feel like I was there when they were first, not when they were created. They had been created 2 decades earlier, but when they were first really starting to take root in the forms that they are now familiar to us today.
Right. Right. Boom. And there it is. That's that moment that I look for with anybody that I talk to. It's the connection between what was and what is. And I will say that during those years, I was a huge comics fan. I mean, I grew up with a bit of a mix of Marvel and DC, but Marvel primarily. And Captain America and the Hulk were my
Wow.
superheroes.
Yeah, I see
And
the shields back there. You've
yes,
got
yes.
a physical shield, and the other one is that a poster back there?
I've got a prop replica and I've got a poorly made shield that was not worth the money. But I those were my comics, and would I would absolutely run to the bookstore, which is where that was my primary comic spot
Mm.
in my little hometown, to see if there was a new issue. And when the Hulk in particular, that that time in the early '80s, they had a magazine-sized comic as well,
Oh,
and
yeah. The
and that
Savage Hulk? Rampaging Hulk? Forget which one it was.
I'm not sure now that you say it, but it also had articles about, the artists at the TV show, and so anyway, I digress, but I'm so jealous because and this is the difference between growing up in a small town and growing up Manhattan adjacent or in Manhattan. If I had made that call and she said, "Could you be here in 10 minutes?" It would not have happened. It would have been a much
Yeah,
bigger stretch.
you woulda needed a DeLorean with, special modifications for that to happen.
So now you're there. You're in this place day to day. You're interacting with the people that we now think of as, they're the pantheon of legends, right? So talk about what that day to day life was like, what it was like working with them. I would love to hear it.
Well, I think that anyone who has suddenly been thrust into a situation where they are, alternatively, near their heroes, but also in a completely sort of like entry level subservient role, probably is familiar with what I'm about to say, which is I walked around the entire time trying to maintain a mask of like dispassionate teenage disinterest while inside just going, "Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god!" and trying to hide the fact that felt like I had hit the jackpot. I was the proverbial kid in the candy store, and I would do things like, they'd give me a stack of pages to go Xerox, and we had to Xerox the full-size comic pages, which were about 1117, down to 8.5 by 11 so that various things could be done to them. They could be scripted, they could be colored, all those sorts of things. Total menial job, and nobody wanted to do it, but I was always like, "Me! I will do the Xeroxing." And so, probably for the first 2 weeks, I would take the pages and I would smell them because they were the smell of graphite and India ink and eraser rubber and Bristol board, and I would deeply inhale, and you know how they say that smell is the most evocative emotion or
Yes.
sense? I can remember to this moment what that smelled like. Inhaling a full page of Secret Wars,
Wow.
like going like, "Wow," and just seeing how crisp. Because as the comics collector yourself back in the day, by the time the comics were printed on that crappy newsprint, which was intended to last a month and then
Right.
disintegrate,
Right.
yellow away into obscurity, the lines were barely visible. They certainly weren't sharp. Seeing the pen and ink drawings on this crisp Bristol board was just like, to me, it was like standing up close to a Picasso must
Yeah.
be to an art lover. So the physical product was great, but what was, as you point out, even more amazing was the fact that I could just walk up to the guy who basically defined who Spider-Man was, John
Yep.
Romita,
Mm.
who worked on staff as the art director, and say, "Hey, this editor needs this art correction done." And then he'd go, "Oh, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to do this." And I was literally standing behind the shoulder of what was likely one of the greatest Marvel Comics artists who ever lived. And he was telling me, some punk 17-year-old kid from Queens, what his creative decisions were going to be about like improving this particular comic. And
Amazing.
so I could not have, I would have paid, not that I had any money, I would have paid to be there, but, they were initially giving me school credit. And then after the school year ended, they kept me on as a minimum wage slave, which I loved, and I learned and I built relationships. And every chance I got, I would Xerox a comic, I would Xerox a script, keep a copy for myself, totally illegal.
Of
But
course.
I was studying. I was in the hothouse and I was studying the craft because I wanted to be a comic creator myself. And, there were people out in the world who were paying good money to go to art school. And here I was being paid minimum wage to get the best goddamn education in
Right.
this that you could imagine.
A
I felt
master
like
class.
I felt like I was cheating at life at that moment.
I but you know what? That is exactly how legends are made. So in that time, and I know it's muddied a lot since then, but there was basically it was DC and it was Marvel.
Yes.
So what was it like when you think about that period in time versus today, where there's so much more baggage attached to that because of all of the different properties and where they've manifested themselves. What what was the world like then with whether it was competitive or complementary between those two publications?
Oh, sure. Great question. The interesting thing is, as you said, now you've got the DC extended universe and the Marvel cinematic universe, and there's detractors and there's a lot of fuzz around that. Back then, they were two competitive publishing companies
Hmm.
based in New York, only a few blocks from each other. DC was a little bit uptown, we were more downtown. Um, but DC had the more mainline and mainstream characters. Batman had been a very popular television show in the '60s, and then it had been, rerun ad nauseum into the '70s. And so everyone knew Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin,
Sure.
Pow, Biff, Bam. Even to this day, if someone does a magazine article about comic books, they do the Pow, Biff, Bam sort of like sound effects as part of like the illustration. That's some cultural baggage that we'll never outgrow. Superman the movie was a huge hit in the '70s,
Oh, right.
and that franchise continued into I think the early '80s, progressively poorer iterations, but Superman was top of mind for all. So we at Marvel, certainly we had Spider-Man, which had a cartoon and a couple of TV shows and all that. But we always felt like we were the underdogs, We
Yeah.
had Fantastic Four and Iron Man and Captain America, and we felt like our characters were superior. We felt like our execution, our stories were superior. They were more grounded in real life. Captain America, I think in the era that you were reading it, lived in Brooklyn Heights, and he worked as a professional illustrator, and he had neighbors, and he had to, like, ride his motorcycle over the bridge into work. Meanwhile, over at DC, you've got, the billionaire who lives in a mansion and a Batcave in a fake city, Gotham City, and then there's a guy who lives in another fake city, right? Every city was fake. And so what I loved about Marvel was real life. You felt like you could come around the corner in New York City and run into Matt Murdock as Daredevil, right? So
Right.
we always felt that the Marvel comics should be more resonant in pop culture, and we were always I had sort of like an underdog feeling against DC, and so we were always trying to find ways to overmatch them. The movies that were out then for Marvel were awful. There was a terrible Captain America movie that had come out and like gone straight to VHS.
Hey,
you
hey,
know,
Reb Brown is a hero, my friend. Reb Brown is a hero. Look him
yeah.
up on
So
IMDb.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So we had a rivalry with them professionally,
Sure.
but on a personal level, we were all in it together. It was comics against the world. We weren't taken seriously by real book publishers. Uh, you know, People who went to Hollywood and made movies, including Stan Lee, who had moved to Hollywood, a few years earlier. That was real media. TV and movies, that was real media.
Right.
Newspapers, that was real journalism. Prose books, that was real literature. Comic books were always, so I think that it formed a bond in the industry. And so even though by day we would be completely cutthroat and fighting for rack space in the bookstores and the newsstands of the day, by evening or on the weekends, we all socialized. We were friends, and we would go to dinners. There was a weekly dinner that we had at a Italian restaurant in Midtown, halfway between the two offices, and
Oh,
we'd sit there, and I'd sit there with legends, Bill Sienkiewicz, who had just come off of Elektra Assassin, and you know, Mike Carlin, who ended up going on to basically be the quintessential Superman editor at the time he was at Marvel. Bob Harris, who was the navigator, the editor who made X-Men into a cultural phenomenon. Chris Claremont, the writer of X-Men.
sure.
All the people would come to dinner, and I'd be sitting there going, "What am I doing here?" You know? We'd have softball games, fun rivalries between Marvel and DC. And I think that even more importantly and more interestingly is that when people's careers would sunset in one place, they'd sunrise in the other. So we had enormous amounts of crossover, people leaving Marvel and going to DC, vice versa.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so, in the end, it really became more about a comics industry versus a DC and Marvel split. And, as the comics industry grew and you ended up having offshoots later in the 90s, like Image Comics and
Yeah.
Valiant Comics, there was a migration out from the two big ones and new talent coming in. And so, but it was, I think, those bridges that were built in the 80s between the professionals who were rivals in business, but comrades in life and in careers, I think really contributes to, again, where we are today,
Right.
where,
Right.
they've actually now sort of put a lot of weight behind making these things the cultural juggernaut that they are. Many of my peers of the time are now leading the comic book companies of today.
Yeah.
One of my fellow interns, Marie Javins, is now the editor in chief of DC Comics, and she's done an amazing job of building audiences, of increasing the quality level. And I'm just so proud of her and all of the people I worked with at how far they've come and where they've taken the industry.
And we'll be right back. Hydration plus hygiene equals human dignity. Thursdeities is sponsored by drivebydogooder's.org. With no overhead, no agenda, pure giving, Drive By Do-Gooders provides basic human necessities to those living in downtown Los Angeles and homeless encampments around the city, particularly the elderly and disabled and their pets. Founded in 2015 by Licia Naff with the goal of filling in the gaps where public welfare services fall short, Drive By Do-Gooders does exactly that. They drive to the needy and displaced, handing out essentials: water, wipes, socks, snacks, feminine products, masks, tarps, blankets, and more to those who have little or no access to basic human necessities. Drive By Do-Gooders' mission is to help as many people as possible, bringing relief to those who need it the most. The homeless epidemic can seem overwhelming, but even small gestures can go a long ways to helping those in need to find more permanent solutions. You can help Drive By Do-Gooders to continue this important work and expand their reach. Go to drivebydogooder's.org to learn more and donate, because hydration plus hygiene equals human dignity. drivebydogooder's.org. It means so much to think about the people that were so influential to all of us who were comic fans being able to sort of set down the swords and shields and be a community at the same time as they were establishing, what is now such a well-established world. And you invoked a name that, of course, we have to talk about for a minute, which is Stan Lee, who, regardless of what you may know about Stan or have heard about him, of course, his many, many cameos over the years, I would love to hear Marc Siry's take on Stan Lee, because at the end of the day, he was just a guy. And so tell me about your time with him.
Absolutely. So as you point out, I think most people alive today probably have experienced Stan in one of his cameos during the Marvel movies, where he usually plays some sort of hapless character who's caught up in something or is, sort of uh, part of the action on the sidelines, and he has some funny one-liner. and he appears in different roles. And he's always like sort of this enthusiastic, but sort of like somewhat distractible old guy. Well, earlier in the earlier years of Marvel, prior to the '80s, he was Marvel's number one hype man. He was on every editorial page. I'm sure you remember. Stan Lee Presents
Of
was
course.
the logo at the beginning of every Marvel comic. And he was, whether it was the convention circuit or, radio or television at the time, he was this larger than life hype man for Marvel Comics, talking about the Marvel age of comics when really DC was outselling Marvel 10 to 1 for
Wow.
many of those years. Um, coming into Marvel, I had this image of a larger than life guy
For
who
sure.
was, a showman, but like, again, they always say never meet your heroes because they end up not measuring up. Well, I was fortunate enough to meet Stan and work with him. It wasn't just like, "Hey, how you doing?" It was we were working on projects together because, you mentioned Captain America. The editorial office I ended up working in was the old line books, and so the books we covered were Captain America, Doctor Strange, Daredevil, Fantastic Four, and Thor. And so those were the 5 monthly books that we worked on, and any special projects that came out of those lines would also fall in our lap.
Okay.
So at some point, Stan decided he and John Buscema, another legend of, mostly known for Conan, but, he did a lot of other work as well. We're going to do a Silver Surfer graphic novel together. And it was going to be a hardback. It was going to be a large format. And so we had to do all sorts of things that we weren't used to doing at Marvel, new printing processes, all sorts of things.
Oh,
So I was on the phone with Stan almost every week talking about some element of the project. And I am pleased to report that Stan in real life is exactly like
ah,
the character he played in Marvel. He was larger than life. He was irascible. He was expressive.
oh,
He actually would say "Excelsior," which was his trademark line. But he was also the nicest, kindest guy. I think he was very aware that me, as a low level at that time assistant editor,
hmm
was shaking in my boots dealing with him, and I felt a lot of pressure. And I was the touch point for him to the
yes.
New York offices because he was out in California, and he was always so gracious to me. Never chewed me out for making a mistake, and I made a lot of mistakes. Uh,
What?
Always sent me thank you notes. Well, like I said, we were doing things that we weren't used to doing with a hardback book, with lithographic printing versus offset printing from, the normal newsprint
Right.
process that crappy comics were made on.
Right. Very different
So
world. Yeah.
yeah, I made some very expensive mistakes, and
What?
luckily, I think it's because I was so cheap. Stan was just super gracious, wrote me thank you notes, call me up, ask me how I was doing. He didn't
Oh,
have to do any of that stuff, but it just showed what a great guy he was. And there's a lot of noise in the world about his treatment of Jack Kirby.
right.
And again, this might be one of these places where business separates from the person.
Yeah.
But I never had anything but great experiences with him.
That's good to hear. And I remember seeing his bylines, and I bought How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way.
Right.
I think it was in 1982 when I bought that big hardbound book because I thought I could be a comics artist, which I cannot be. Full disclosure, I cannot draw comics the Marvel way. He was the consistent front door. Well, so to talk about, so you worked with all these now legends. How did they fare in the world as their active careers sort of sunset? They were responsible for creating these extraordinary characters, these universes, these worlds that we still are dialed into. What happened to them?
Yeah, that's another one of these business versus idealism type of conversations. Whenever anyone did creative work for Marvel, when you filled out the form that you used to get paid. It was called a voucher at the time. It was about a 5 by 7, maybe a little smaller slip of paper. You filled in your the work that you were doing, your page rate, the book you were on, and then you signed it. And when you signed it, you signed the print on the back of it, which said that everything that you do for Marvel Comics and that we pay for you for is considered work for hire.
Mm.
Everything, all your concepts, all of your work, your illustration, all of the creative derivatives are owned fully and entirely by Marvel Comics. And uh, in this and every conceivable universe. So what that meant was when Walt Simonson, who was the brilliant writer artist behind what we consider to be the modern version of Thor today, he revivified that character. It was a character in the doldrums in the 70s. In the 80s, he brought that character back, made it relevant, and everything he did has served for the incredibly successful Thor and Avengers movies that we have today. When he was paid his $340 or whatever for penciling an issue of Thor, that was it. Now, later on, there was another editor-in-chief, who after, Stan left, a guy named Jim Shooter took over, also a very controversial figure, but Jim was responsible really for transforming Marvel into a modern media company. He managed to, among other people, including Neil Adams, another very famous, artist and writer, well, I think he's more an artist, they managed to get something called royalties so that people would get royalties on books sold. So if you sold a lot of books, suddenly in the mid-80s, comic book artists were making money. They were making monies off of the sales, but
Ah,
that would be nothing compared to residuals from merchandising, from
right.
movie making and all this. And so, most people don't speak about it. Now I'm still very much in touch with a lot of these people, including Walt. But, if Thor, Ragnarok goes on to make $1 billion, I think, Walt is lucky if they, like, send him a poster and a pittance of a check and invite him to the set to be an extra in the movie.
Oh
These
man.
people are not riding high off of the fruits of their creative labor.
Yeah.
All of that value accrued to Marvel, the company,
Yep.
which then ended up going bankrupt in the late '90s, I
Right.
believe, and receivership. And then, so all this work. Now, fortunately, many of those people who did that work were able to parlay that into later on careers where they were able to creator-owned books, where they were able to realize more of the value. But I would say that the vast majority of them are, criminally
Mm,
undercompensated for the contributions, the hard work they put in during the '80s, which is
right.
now paying off in the 21st century.
Yeah, in a big
None
way.
of them have been compensated to the level that I believe they should.
Right. Yeah, it's I know, and it's such a controversial topic because and it continues the whole notion of what an artist creates, who owns that, and for how long, and in what forms. I mean, the whole SAG and actors strike
Exactly.
last a year were about that very topic, as they have been the past, I think, 2 or 3 strikes have been about, "Hey, if you're gonna take what I'm doing and extend it to other things, I, as the artist that created it, would like some aspect of that to come back to me." It hurts my heart a bit to hear that because those guys had such an impact on all of us who are comic fans. And for those like you who worked with them, who knew what they did, who knew just how deeply they affected the characters and the universes they were creating. We want to think about them sitting on a special seat in the clouds where they're able to enjoy their laurels.
Many of them, I mean, I think about one particular creator. I'm not going to name him because he shares a lot of this on his Facebook page privately, but he is a fan favorite. People revere his work from the '80s, and he is struggling.
Mm,
No health insurance, no pension, no savings. He
uh,
makes his money flying, and he's getting up there in years. Makes his money flying from convention to convention and doing sketches for $25 a pop.
oh my god.
It's Yeah, again, I don't wanna hurt your heart anymore, Bill, but, this is it is a tough, tough, life to have chosen.
Yeah.
To your point, these people loved comics. They love the medium. They sacrifice so much, and they put so much of their lives into the medium at a time when it was struggling to distinguish itself against all these other forms of media, and they broke through, but the success of the medium didn't bring them along.
So connecting that time to where we are now, because we've alluded to it quite a bit. I know that you had mentioned before that Secret Wars was one of the things that you worked on, and certainly that is becoming front and center now as part of the larger extended Marvel universe. Can you talk a bit about how that moment in time in the 80s does connect to this new world we're in now, where these are mega media properties, mega media companies that have grown from the seeds that were planted then?
Absolutely. So I'm gonna harken back to something you said earlier. You said you loved Captain America and you loved Hulk. And so what most comic fans were like that. They had a couple of books they liked. Oh, I like Batman, I like Superman. And from the beginning, there had always been this idea like, well, if you have people who are Iron Man fans and you have people who are Thor fans, let's create a book where they're both in there, and then they can, the Avengers. And a fan of Iron Man will pick it up because they see Iron Man on the cover, and then they'll say, "Hey, who's this Thor guy?" And maybe they'll start reading Thor. And so that was always sort of the cross promotional idea behind group books and guest stars and all that other stuff. And through the 70s and the early 80s, it was done with intention, but it was not done with strategy. And so it was more like, "Oh, Wolverine's suddenly popular, so let's have Wolverine appear in every book." But it was just like the story had to be contrived in a way because there was a loose continuity between these books where the story had to be contrived in a way that, like, well, why is Wolverine hanging out in New York and he runs into Spider-Man, you know? And so and certainly, some of these early guest appearances and crossovers, as we called them, had the book with Wolverine would sell a little more. Great. But would you create a bunch of new Spider-Man fans? Uh, well, not usually, right? People would go back to they'd buy the book for Wolverine and then maybe a small fraction would start to buy the other book. Secret Wars was, as far as I can tell, I think there was another one earlier than it called Contest of Champions, which was much more limited. But Secret Wars was the first time that this guy, Jim Shooter, and many other on the editorial team decided that they were going to create a strategic, sustained crossover event that not only brought the characters together into a single book, but then rippled out from a storyline perspective,
Mhm.
from a narrative dependency perspective to all the other books.
Oh,
And
wow.
so what that meant was if you start the story in one book, you had to buy the other book to finish the story.
Brilliant.
That was very, very rare before Secret Wars. And so it worked so well that Secret Wars sold enormous amounts. All the books connected to it received enormous lifts, especially when Spider-Man came back from Secret Wars with his new black costume, which
Mm,
was a storyline in the movies later on, many years
sure.
later in the 90s and the 2000s. That suddenly the comics industry became addicted to these crossover events. And so one of the crossover events that followed Secret Wars was the Infinity Gauntlet. And the
Heard
Infinity
of it.
Gauntlet, yes, exactly. The Infinity Gauntlet ended up providing all of the seed corn for the Avengers storyline, basically, from, the first few Avengers movies all the way through Endgame, two of the most massive money-making, theatrical events with the same idea. Like, if you wanted to pick up the story from the end of Thor Ragnarok, where Thanos' ship appears, you needed to go see Infinity War, right?
Yep.
And you needed to have seen Black Panther to understand, uh, you know, and you needed to have seen Winter Soldier to understand where Black Panther. Anyway, so I feel like in the 80s, Marvel set the groundwork for this narrative dependency and crossovers in a shared universe that set up the MCU of the 2000s and the 2010s and, now the 21st century to become essentially the largest single cinematic, taken in bulk,
Right.
cinematic franchise in history. Maybe I'm sure it's probably outstripped James Bond by now, but certainly in terms of velocity and audience growth and earnings, it's just an incredible juggernaut. So I do think that the '80s were a special time when people, I think, started to think more broadly about their lives and how, their culture and how they were enjoying different types of media. New things were coming out, CD players,
Hmm.
digital laser discs, things like that. And so I think that that gave Marvel the time and space to say, we're not going to just think of each comic as a individual magazine that someone's going to buy and hope they buy the next one. We're going to start thinking more broadly and strategically about
Right.
this content, this franchise, this world, this shared universe, the Marvel universe.
Which sounds
And
incredibly prescient now, but
yeah,
but you realize there's no way they could have seen 30, 40 years down the line where that would take us in the sheer size and scale and global reach as well.
yeah, yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were always overseas versions of our comics, but it was onesie twosies. To the point about not seeing this, I think that there was always a hope, like, well, hopefully someday they'll make a good Spider-Man.
Sure,
So,
right.
I feel like if some of the people who I worked with today then, who are no longer with us, could see where we are today, they would, I mean, I think their heads would spin because none of us could have ever imagined we'd be in a place like we are today.
Right, right. You mentioned in our back and forth before we started this conversation, about Easter eggs and in jokes in media today. Talk a bit about that. That's another place where those seeds are blossoming in strange and unusual ways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, actually, I just referenced, just obliquely someone who's no longer with us. My, first real boss at Marvel, who I worked for directly as, in an editorial office, was a gentleman named Mark Grunwald. And Mark was responsible probably for the bulk of the Captain America comics you were reading. He was the writer for many, many years, 8 or 9 years on Captain America. He helped guide as the executive editor of Marvel Comics for many years. He helped guide a lot of this. He was the creator, and, overall editor for the Marvel Universe Handbook, which is where I worked for him, which was literally an attempt to rationalize all these characters into a singular shared universe. And to that end, he was always having to deal with paradoxes about, like, well, in this particular comic line, Spider-Man said this, or the Human Torch's powers could do that. But then here, there's an inconsistency. How do we rationalize that? And so the Marvel Universe Handbook, was an attempt to rationalize that in terms of, like, setting everyone in the same grounded universe. But then he also created rules around time travel and consistency within the comics, and sort of introduced the idea of the retcon, right? It had been being done for a while, but the idea that, well, the reason why there's this inconsistency is because someone traveled back in time and created an alternate universe and this, that, and the other thing. So many of the things that he used to say in our plot conversations were have now shown up in movies
Oh
as
boy.
things the characters say to rationalize their shared universe.
Oh, that's
To me,
funny.
one of the most emblematic ones is the conversation about how time travel works in Avengers Endgame, where they're saying it's not like Back to the Future, it's like this, it's like that. So much of that came from this guy, Mark Grunwald. Another bit, of which is Mark Grunwald related, is that to my point earlier about all of us socializing, we would go to the convention, the big comic book convention in San Diego, and every year, Mark's schedule was packed, but he always made the effort to go with a bunch of other comics pros and rent jet skis and jet ski on San Diego Bay. And so years later,
Oh,
when
I know where you're going.
yeah, totally. I guess you're a Marvel fan, right? So years later, when Walt Simonson had to create a set of characters to help the Fantastic Four navigate some time streams, he created something called the Time Variance Authority, and he made the main character look like Mark Grunwald, and that was a character named Mobius. And so Mark Grunwald became the keeper of time in the comics. And then that got moved forward into the Loki series on Disney Plus.
Yep.
Character Owen Wilson plays, also named Mobius, who physically was made up to look like Mark. He had a
Unbelievable.
mustache, he was sort of schlubby, and Mark was losing his hair. Owen had a lot more hair. Mark had a beard, Owen was clean shaven. But he was, and then the hilarious thing to me, what I saw, which really made my heart sing, was when they made Mobius have a strange fascination for jet skis.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, and then later in the series, it's revealed why, but, like, when I saw that, I was like, "That is a tribute to Mark," and
Mm,
literally only people who know Mark would know that, you
right.
know?
Yeah.
It's, it was just a moment, where I just said, "I can't believe that," echoes of 1984
Yep.
jet skiing on San Diego Bay are now in front of me on Disney Plus.
Yeah, and they're canon as part of that
Yeah,
universe.
yeah, crazy.
That is an extraordinary tribute, and on so many levels, because it's a fun bit of story business for those of us who didn't know that. But for those of you who were in the know on sort of where that came from, I can only imagine what it was like seeing that on screen.
Yeah, it does add a richness to the storytelling, and you're like, "Oh, that's random. Jet skiing, that's strange," but
Right.
then it came from something, from the heart. Now,
Yeah.
if I may indulge myself one thing,
Please.
let me talk about one Easter egg that was something I set and something I did and something that came back to haunt me.
Yes.
So, I mentioned that Mark would have plot discussions with us. We would go out to lunch, and he'd talk about the stories he was writing for Captain America, and how he had to work through some sort of narrative thing, and we would all contribute, right? And Mark was a brilliant guy. He didn't need our contributions, but I think that sometimes just talking it out helps him work some stuff out. But one time we're sitting there and he goes, "Well, guys, I've got a problem. Um, Cap was just blown out of an Avengers Quinjet last episode, and the last issue. And sorry, I said episode, not issue. This was back in the days of print. Last issue, and we left with him falling to his death. And there's no parachute anywhere. There's no, there's no. How do we get him out of this? And so we were talking, and I said, "Now wait a second. Cap's shield absorbs all impact directed to it, correct?" And Mark said, "Yes." And I said, "So if Cap is standing there and a giant boulder hit the shield, the energy is completely absorbed and it's as if, Cap feels nothing or feels very little." Mark says, "Yes." And I go, "Why don't we turn that around? What happens if Cap is behind his shield and he lands on the ground and the shield absorbs all of the energy of the impact? Wouldn't that save Cap?" And Mark was like, "Oh my God, you solved it. That's
Oh,
great."
boy.
And
Winter
so,
Soldier time.
I can't believe that you picked that right up, Phil.
Yep.
Yes, yes. Well, so now here's the thing. Um, Mark had Cap take his shield off his back and then strap his feet into the straps, and he sort of like windsurfed the shield down, landed, and it absorbed most of the impact, and then he sort of rolled with it and like picked it up and said, "Oh, I'm so smart," right?
Aha.
Years later, I thought to myself, actually, hold on a second. The shield would absorb the impact and the shield would stop moving, but the rest of Cap's body, which is on the side of the shield that doesn't absorb the impact, would continue down at terminal velocity and pancake him into the shield. And so now, of course, this was years
Details,
later, too
details.
late. Yes, exactly. It was too late to say, actually, Mark, that concept I gave you would absolutely not work in real life. I don't think anyone ever called us out on it, but I was super embarrassed after the fact that I had given him this idea. He had run with it. He had made it into print. And now here I felt like responsible for this piece of essentially bad science, right? Okay, it's a comic, it's fantasy, whatever. Anyhow, to your point, I'm sitting there, I'm watching Winter Soldier, I'm enjoying myself in the theater. Cap runs towards a like 15-story window, bashes through it with his shield, rides the shield down, shield absorbs the impact. He's a little stunned, but he gets up, shrugs it off, and runs away. And
Mhm.
I'm just sitting there like popcorn, mid-flight to my mouth going like, "Oh my god. My stupid mistake made it into the Winter Soldier." And
Yep.
my kids, who I told about this years ago, they were like, "Dad, isn't" and I'm like, "Yes, yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry."
That is a
So,
beautiful moment on so many levels.
yeah, yeah. So again, here's your string from the '80s. My triumphant but completely incorrect solution to a problem came back to haunt me during
Well,
a screening of The Winter Soldier decades later.
but the street cred that comes with that, I mean, that means that you're part of all of the origin story as well.
Yeah, well, some of us have brighter stars than others, I guess.
I'm imagine you're just waiting for the dump truck of cash to back up to your driveway.
Yeah, that's not hasn't happened yet.
Okay, we'll give it time. So you've now moved on in your life and career. Here we are. It's a good well, literally 40 years, almost
Yeah.
40 years later. How has that time in your life, very formative time of your life, how has that informed the rest of your career? How have you worked storytelling the Marvel way into Marc Siry's life story?
Well, you used a term earlier, which I think about almost every day, and that is origin story. And one of the most powerful aspects of the sort of comic book medium is the idea that there is some incepting event and it changes someone's life and it puts their life on a new track. And for me, of course, it was that bluffing my way into Marvel Comics on that, you know, uh, afternoon in New York City back in actually it was 1984. Another thing that I learned from Marvel was the art of storytelling. And as I said earlier, the idea was that you'd pick up a comic book. If you liked it, you'd read it. Maybe you'd buy the next one. But the problem that Marvel always had was that every comic might be somebody's first comic. So they taught us at Marvel. They literally had assistant editor school where they sat us down and they taught us the rules of storytelling. And they said, since every comic might be a person's first, these are the rules. On the cover, you need to see the character clearly in costume, and they need to be in some sort of peril or adventurous situation. On the first splash page, the character should be using their powers in an interesting way that makes the person want to turn to the next page.
Okay.
And then ultimately, when they see that the story continues, they close the book and then they go buy it. Now, they're sitting at home and they're reading the comic. It's their first comic. They have no idea who Spider-Man is. So in the first 3 pages, you need to work into dialogue their long-term status quo. And so you've got Spider-Man swinging around the city saying, "Gosh, ever since I was bitten by that radioactive spider and gained these spider powers, the only way I can relax is by, clear my head is by swinging around Manhattan on these webs that I created myself." Then you got to move the story forward and get the person invested in that comic. And then, so in the next page or two, Spidey's got to think to himself, well, there's no time to think about that now since Doc Ock has stolen a nuclear bomb and is going to detonate it in New York Harbor unless I get Aunt May to agree to marry him. Which, by the way, I think is pretty close to a real story fly
I believe you're
in Marvel
correct. I
Comics.
believe you are
Yes.
correct.
But in any case, so what I took away from that is that every encounter with a person, in the case of Marvel Comics, someone buying a book, or in the case of your business world, pitching somebody a new idea, asking for budget, trying to get a job, you need to do 3 things. You need to establish your origin story, explain the incepting event that led you to being right there in that pitch room, in that job interview, in that budget meeting to justify why you're there and why you should be there. Then you have to set the long-term status quo. You have to explain to the people you are talking to how the world is now and what's good about it, what's bad about it, how it came to be. And then you very quickly need to go to the short-term status quo, the ask, why you should hire me, why you should give me budget for this project, why I need to be able to have this type of technology in the stack and not that other type of technology in the stack. And Billiam, you and I had a lot of those conversations at AOL when we
Yeah.
were there. I know that you were a key cog in the operations engine at AOL. So I'm sure that you probably had dozens of those conversations on a
For
weekly
sure.
basis. And
Yep.
so to me, at Marvel, learning that, like how you tell that story, how you engage someone, paint the bigger picture, and then get to that ask, get to that short-term status quo, it's something that I replay in my mind in almost every business interaction I have. I just spent a week in Barcelona pitching Meta AI to 10 CEOs of wireless companies around the globe. Some of them didn't speak English, so it was translated into Korean or Japanese. But I had to stand up in front of them and in 15 minutes make the CEO of a company that serves 500 million Filipinos wireless. I had to make them understand why they should care about the work I do.
That's
And so
extraordinary.
I every day I reach back to what I learned in the '80s in the halls of Marvel Comics about how to set the stage, how to tell the story, and how to make them want to buy the next issue. And that's what I bring with me, and I'm incredibly thankful to all the mentors I had, all the people who gave me a chance along the way, and all the folks I've worked with, including you, along the way, who have let me be that storyteller and allowed me to make a living out of, hopefully painting a picture of what the next issue will bring.
Well, that is something. Uh, you and I definitely are on the same page about storytelling, the power of storytelling, the value of storytelling, not just in everyday life, but with the work that we do. And I didn't go through the assistant editor's training, but I think my years of exposure to comic books and of course my obsessive love with TV
Of course,
taught
the
me.
dramatic structure in TV and
Yep.
movies is the same sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me how in our day-to-day lives we encounter people who are incredibly smart, incredibly capable, incredibly accomplished, and yet their ability to tell a story is somewhat limited. And the value and the impact of being able to tell the story, and
Right.
I think you articulated it perfectly. It's what brings us all back to the table to, well, whether it's to see the next Marvel movie or to, if we are the person responsible for that budget at work, to sign off on buying, or to make our case for somebody else. All very well said. And my God, linked all back to the 80s, which is, of course, my favorite thing.
Hey, it's the decade that made us,
It
Billiam.
really,
So
it really is.
it's something I could never forget. And so I'm so thrilled to have been a guest on your podcast. I look forward to future episodes with great excitement. And uh, I would say my one achievement is I've managed to get my kids into the '80s music too. So
Ah, that's
they actually are happy when some of my old music comes on the radio.
well, that's an accomplishment by itself. You can now you have accomplished. You've reached the pinnacle of parenting, getting your
Right,
kids to love what you loved.
right.
Well, Marc Siry, thank you so very much for your time, for sharing your story and stories. It's all of the things I love about having conversations like this with people that I not only share a history with, but also I get to discover a lot more about their history and my own through the process. So thank you so much. You are, as always, a good friend and a great storyteller.
Well, thank you very much, Billiam, and from you, that's a high compliment.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. You take care of yourself. And next time you're back here in the States, particularly in the East Coast, let's get together.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for listening. I know I went a bit longer on this episode, but I'll tell you, for so many of the things we grew up loving, books, sports ball, Battle of the Network Stars on ABC, it's rare that we get a firsthand account of what was happening behind the scenes and from someone with whom we have a personal connection. So this was a big treat for me. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Just a reminder, go to drivebydogooders.com to donate today. Until next time, as Stan Lee would say, Excelsior!